All right, Benoit is a researcher and lecturer on illicit trade and terrorism issues. He is a successional lecturer at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, where he teaches Master of Global Affairs courses on researching terrorism, illicit trade in drugs, and a capstone seminar on global security. He is a research consultant at the University of Bath, where he focuses on the illicit tobacco trade, and the managing editor of Stability and International Journal on Security Development. It is with pleasure that I introduce you all to Benoit. He will speak today on how the illicit drug trade is adapting to the COVID-19 crisis, and I'm sure that you all will find this a very interesting talk. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation, Margaret. As you can all notice, we're going to be switching gears quite a bit here. Very different topic, but I really appreciate Columbia taking on such an interdisciplinary approach. I think there's this idea of range that David Epstein has written about lately is very important especially when it comes to facing unprecedented crises like this one. So I certainly appreciate the opportunity. Thank you to Margaret and Jesse and others for putting all this together. So as Margaret mentioned, I've been covering this sort of topic from two different angles over the past decade or so. The first one is sort of the illicit drug trade, so illicit drugs, the war on drugs, how to move past this, how to explore different potential scenarios that would be more beneficial and adequate compared to what we have at the moment. As well as the illicit tobacco trade, and especially the role of the tobacco industry in smuggling their own products, or at least in being complicit and involved to some extent in fueling that trade. And so with the course that I'm teaching on the illicit trade in drugs at the University of Toronto, a few weeks ago, as I think it was around mid-March, I started talking to my students about what the COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic, but also the responses by national governments and the economic crisis and all that, what sort of impacts this might have on the illicit drug trade. So certainly appreciate and would like to credit some of my students for getting that discussion started. So as any good academic, I'm going to start with some definition just to frame the discussion today. I like to use this definition by the WHO. So this is from, so let me try to rearrange stuff here. This is from the WHO Framework Convention, the FCTC, on tobacco control protocol to eliminate the illicit tobacco trade. And it basically defines the illicit trade as any practice or conduct prohibited by law and which relates to production, shipment, receipt, possession, distribution, sale, or purchase, including any practice or conduct intended to facilitate such activity. And I like this definition because it really encompasses the whole supply chain of illicit trade, all the way from production to purchase to by consumers, as well as any activities intended to facilitate it. So, for example, money laundering, corruption, and so on and so forth. Because very often when we think about the illicit drug trade, we think about trafficking, we think about narcos, and we don't really think about everything that needs to happen along the supply chain to facilitate that process. The definition I like to use is one by Mark Kleiman, who unfortunately passed away last year. He was, a pioneer in drug policy research, and certainly inspired a lot of young scholars to take on that sort of research area. Very thought-provoking and at times provocative researcher who is certainly sorely missed. And in 2002, he had this definition of a drug, so a chemical that influences biological function other than by providing nutrition or hydration. So what's interesting is it really includes and encompasses anything from plant drugs to lab drugs, traditional and new. And it's also important to notice that there's really a range of different sort of harms that drugs may cause, from coffee all the way to heroin, for example. And he also defines psychoactive drug as a drug whose influence in part on mental function, so on mood, perception, cognition, and behavior. So I know I'm surrounded by a lot of medical scientists here, so I'm not teaching you a lot, but just so we're clear on what I'll be talking about today. And as I said, so I'll be focusing here today, and I've been focusing on in my research on the illicit trade in legal drugs, so like tobacco, cannabis in some jurisdictions, including US states and Canada where I'm based, regulated opioids as well, and illegal drugs, so like cocaine and heroin, for example. And so just to give you a sense of what I'll be covering today, so I'll start with some caveats, then I'll give you a sort of broad overview of the main impacts we've seen so far and across the main stages of the supply chain in terms of what sort of adaptation COVID-19 has caused. And then I'll try and stress a few important issues when it comes to governance, especially as it relates to national governments trying to mitigate organized crime. And then I'll conclude with a few thoughts, and I'll try to make sure to leave enough time for Q&A. So the caveats, well, first of all, it's just very early, right? I think we're all in the same situation here. I've been talking to a bunch of different law enforcement officers in various countries and in parts of international government organizations, and a lot of them are saying the same thing. You know, they're saying this is based on personal observation. We don't have comprehensive data so far. So we've seen media reports, we've seen law enforcement reports, but there's only so much we know at the moment. And it's certainly important to stress that there have been positive and negative impacts on the illicit drug trade so far. And it just remains to be seen which way things will fall in a lot of ways. But we'll explore some of those impacts across the supply chain in a minute. And just as much as drug policy, drug law enforcement, the illicit drug trade has had great variations across countries and regions. Obviously, the impact of the crisis, the pandemic itself, but also the way national governments have responded with curfews, quarantine, and all that. There's been different degrees of impacts across the world, so it's very difficult to generalize what's happening worldwide. And it's also important to remember when we talk about organized crime and the illicit drug trade and all the actors involved, that this is not a homogeneous thing. This is not uniform, even within organized crime groups, like the Sinaloa cartel, for example. There's a lot of different factions, a lot of different individuals that come in and out with different interests, different sort of activities. So we need to be careful when we try to generalize on that front as well. And of course, when it comes to long-term impacts, well, it's obviously very difficult to predict, in part because, as Philip Tetlock would say, political experts are just very bad at predicting the future, but also because a lot of it will depend on how the pandemic evolves and how governments respond to it, right? So let's start with the sort of overview of the supply chains. So when it comes to production, so you might be aware that Afghanistan actually produces 90% of the world's opium production, according to the world's opium, according to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. Opium, which is of course the plant that's being used to produce heroin in particular. And Colombia produces 70% of the world's coca. Coca is a traditional plant that is used for cocaine. And those two countries have so far not been severely affected by COVID-19, with a really big caveat, of course, that the data that we have might not be entirely reliable. And of course, this is still early, so they might be impacted quite severely in the next few weeks and months. So something, of course, to monitor. For example, Afghan migrants that were living in Iran have been coming back to Afghanistan in great numbers in recent weeks. So there might be a spike in cases over the next weeks. And of course, those healthcare systems are not well equipped to deal with the pandemic. So So again, production might be more severely affected in the next few weeks, but so far, it's harvest time in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan has been producing, or it seems to be producing, just as much as in recent years. What we have seen so far, though, is a shortage of fentanyl and chemicals used in the production of fentanyl and methamphetamine. These things are producing great numbers in China, especially the Hubei province. And so we've seen shortages in Mexico and in Southeast Asia in particular. And here's an article that talks about that quite a bit. So the results of that so far has been criminal organizations increasing prices and decreasing the purity of the drugs they make in order to make up for the loss in profit, or at least the anticipated loss. Another thing that we might see in the near future, and given this international crisis, is that organized crime groups might be switching or might start to rely more heavily on domestic drugs. So drugs for which you don't need to rely just quite as much on international supply chains. So cannabis is one of them, for example. When it comes to wholesale distribution, so it's one thing to produce drugs, we obviously need to ship them somewhere. So there has been a decrease in legal trade. So the World Trade Organization is estimating the decrease in legal trade in 2020 at between 13 and 32% so far, which means that there is less of an opportunity to conceal illicit shipments, right? Because the maritime trade, especially the global legal trade, is a great way for illicit traffickers to basically hide their drugs within those massive flows. And those flows really are massive, which is why perhaps wholesale distribution hasn't been as affected as street distribution, as we'll see later. But what I like to do with my students is just give you a sense of those numbers, because I remember starting working on the illicit tobacco trade, especially in 2014, and just struggling to wrap my heads around some of those numbers. So I'll just walk you through a couple of things. So the UNODC and the World Customs Organization estimates that 500 million containers are shipped yearly in the trade supply chain, and of this amount, less than 2% are inspected. So those two organizations have something called the Global Container Control Program, and even in the countries where this is implemented, the inspection rate is still incredibly low, so less than 2%. But so how many, for example, when it comes to the illicit tobacco trade, how many cigarettes can you actually fit in a 20-foot container, for example? I probably shouldn't ask because there's a lot of participants who don't want to get things too messy, but it's 5 million. You can fit 5 million cigarettes in just one container. And you see a picture here of the MSC Goldson. I'm not sure how to pronounce this, but this is the largest container ship in the world. It contains 23,000 containers, which would mean that if you just put cigarettes in all these containers, they would equate to more than 100 billion cigarettes in just one ship. So it just those crazy numbers, just to give you a sense of the sort of scale we're talking about when it comes to the maritime trade, and the how easy it is really for illicit traffickers to basically conceal small shipments of drugs. When it comes to fentanyl, for example, you really need an extremely small dose. So it's incredibly easy to just hide products, so cigarettes and other products. There have been, though, mobility and travel restrictions in Afghanistan and Colombia. So, for example, the borders between Afghanistan and Iraq and Pakistan have been closed, though those borders tend to be porous, so it remains to be seen to what extent wholesale distribution might be impacted there. I talked to someone at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime who said that traffickers may be using a different route, so a northern route through Central Asia to basically continue and smuggle their products to Europe, especially. But there's also been, the border between Colombia and Venezuela has been closed as well. So it is a bit more difficult to ship product overseas. So wholesale distributors will probably need to find different routes, different techniques. But the last few decades have shown how adaptable those organized crime groups are at shifting their routes and things like that. The local farmers are really, the ones that grow poppy or coca are the ones that are going to be most affected if they're not able to sell the products that they grow. And it's obviously not the main group of people that we think about, but some of those people really don't have access to any other kind of income. For example, if you think of remote rural areas of Colombia, as one of the guest speakers in my course was saying the other day, we've been talking about alternative development and crop substitution, but it is precisely because those areas are so remote that they are appealing to drug traffickers, but they're obviously not appealing to other kind of legal distributors of legal crops, who need like good roads and access to those fields. I also talked to a senior law enforcement official in Canada who mentioned that because of the evolving sort of economic crisis, there might be a lot more people who are corruptible along the way. So at ports, amongst customs authority, people with basically security supervision power among those ports might be more easily bribed than in the past. So this would have obviously an impact on all this. But what has been a lot more difficult is basically getting those drugs to the retail market, so to the streets, getting them to people, because with fewer cars and people around, drug dealing has obviously become a lot more conspicuous, and as a result, traffickers have been increasing the prices. We've also seen some reports of stockpiling. Europol published a report suggesting that this might be the case in the next few weeks as well. Stockpiling generally does not occur at that level. It's usually at the production level. So what does that mean? Will there be an increase in theft and violence potentially, and competition between drug trafficking organizations? And this is an interesting article that was published in The Guardian. They interviewed a drug dealer who basically talks about how his day-to-day has been affected. So it's already quite old, from a month ago or so, but he was also already saying that some people are panic buying or stockpiling cocaine already, which has had an impact on the flow of drugs in the country. Now, when it comes to consumption, illicit drug users, especially the most dependent ones, are the ones likely to be most affected. People who need access to those drugs every day and all of a sudden are facing decrease in supply, an increase in prices, a decrease in purity and quality of the drugs, with no sort of transparency as to what the drugs contain, and just an increase in uncertainty. There's a lot for them to deal with. So, as I was saying, countries have been responded in many different ways to this sort of issue, but we've seen new measures put in place in BC, Vancouver, especially in Canada, as well as the UK and to some extent in France, to basically loosen restriction for opioid substitution therapy, like methadone treatment. So basically to avoid having a lot of patients coming every day to pharmacies or methadone clinics to get access to their treatment. So there's been more home deliveries and things like that. Pharmacies are allowed in some jurisdiction to basically hand out drugs, prescribed drugs, without an updated prescription and things like that. And in Canada, especially in BC, we now have a safe supply of opioids, to basically act as a substitute for heroin and fentanyl and other street drugs that are much more dangerous. And this is certainly something that has been advocated for by our harm reduction specialists and academics for quite a while in Vancouver. There's been a few pilot studies done. And it remains to be seen, however, whether this will last beyond the crisis, given the sort of political and ideological pushbacks there may be on this. But here, just as we're nearing conclusion, I'd like to highlight a few really important issues when it comes to governance, because there's a risk that if governments don't do enough, that organized crime groups basically step in to fill the void. And we've already seen organized crime groups in Brazil, in the favelas there, basically stepping in to enforce quarantine and curfew against the wishes of the Bolsonaro government, who has been, downplaying the risk posed by COVID-19, and basically gangs stepping in and saying, no, you all need to stay home. This is a health crisis, and other organized crime groups and gangs have been stepping in to enforce those quarantine and other restrictions in cooperation with the governments of El Salvador and Venezuela, basically outsourcing or delegating that sort of responsibility to those groups. But we've seen as well drug trafficking organizations, organized crime groups in Mexico, in Italy, or even the Yakuza, the traditional sort of organized crime group in Japan, providing free food and hand sanitizers and things like that. And I think what's really important to recognize, we've seen the president of Mexico recently basically dangling the possibility of offering amnesty to some of these groups, given that they provide health and other sorts of services to communities and population. But as Mark Shaw and Tuesday Retaino from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime warn, this is a cynical opportunism, and this is not unprecedented. There's been a lot of previous cases in recent history of those groups coming in after a humanitarian crisis, basically to strengthen their ties in communities and to leverage national governments for a greater influence. So one of the things that the Yakuza have been offering is to sanitize a cruise ship that had been affected by COVID-19, and they did something similar when Fukushima occurred in terms of a few years ago. So this is not only a sort of long-term opportunity for those groups to build their own legitimacy, build up the ties with the communities, being able to ask favors in return and when this is all said and done, but it's also a short-term profit opportunity. So we hear very often of the word counterfeit medicine, but it's also medicines that are smuggled or just substandard, that have been stored properly, which is a really big issue in parts of the world. And recently we've seen, for example, Interpol recently reported that there has been a 100% increase in seizures of unauthorized chloroquine across the world. And of course, there's always caveats to be added when it comes to seizure figures. So the amounts of drugs that are seized by law enforcement and customs. When it comes to to what extent this actually reflects variations in the illicit trade rather than luck or a greater focus by law enforcement agencies on these specific products. So some of it might be a case, but we also seen a rise in smuggling of defective PPE. We've seen thefts of ventilators across Latin America as well. So it really seems that that organized crime groups are really using this as an opportunity to make money. You know, there's obviously an increased demand for PPE, for ventilators, for some of these medicines to some extent, and they're trying to capitalize on that. So if governments are not prepared to manage this whole process well, this void, this governance void, is going to be filled by someone else. And so, but on the other hand, if you put in place measures that are too restrictive, this is also an opportunity for organized crime to step in. So, for example, all tobacco and alcohol sales were banned for a period in South Africa. Now the ban has been lifted for tobacco, but not alcohol. And this runs a risk of increasing the illicit trade. And I certainly understand the sort of public health argument around it, but I think that banning substances altogether.
1 minute left, Benoit.
Okay, especially at short notice, is potentially dangerous. And just in conclusion, I think this offers an opportunity for rethink. You know, I'm sure you've seen the quote, and especially even today, the quote by Winston Churchill, to never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think this shows the importance of instead of having all those products being prohibited and illegal, the importance of potentially having a public health oriented, you know, legalized and regulatory framework, because then it gives you more leverage, more tools to basically control the quality of the products, to control who sells what, and to adjust accordingly when something so as dramatic as this crisis occurs. And here I published a short piece on this in World Politics Review, so feel free to check it out. If you don't have access to a free link, I'm happy to email it to you as well. And I gave you a few more resources if you're interested in finding out more. But I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Benoit. Do we have questions from any of the attendees? Yes, we do. Please go ahead.
Fascinating talk. So I was wondering whether there are movements to establish safe medical places for people who would like to use this opportunity to quit their addiction.
Yes, good question. So that's what I was trying to say with the cases of Vancouver and BC in general, and the UK. Well, really just BC for now, where the government is basically now allowing pharmacies to prescribe drugs and to hand out prescribed drugs in substitution of street drugs like heroin and fentanyl. So yes, it's just this idea of safe supply that has been around in Vancouver, has been discussed for a long time. There's been a couple of pilot projects on it. One of them was Naomi, and which included, I think, dispensing drugs with a vending machine using biometric security and things like that. So there's obviously caveats around it. I don't know if we have really the time to go into a really long, nuanced discussion on it, but yeah, this is certainly something that's slowly being put in place in some jurisdictions.
Benoit, this is Eric.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, there are a lot of people that are unemployed and perhaps under a tremendous amount of stress. And I'm wondering if on the user side, there's evidence that there's increases in either illicit or illegal drug use in countries that are shut down.
Well, this is an interesting one. We don't have enough data to say this one way or another, and the difficulty with the current pandemic is that there's not a lot of precedents to look at in order to see what might happen. So if you can look at the economic crisis from 2008, which sort of showed that there was a decrease in demand for tobacco and alcohol, but actually an increase in demand for illegal drugs, because the illegal drug market is to some extent much more flexible than the legal one. So people were able to to switch to other illegal drugs. So some of them, there was a shortage of some of them, but some others were more readily available and accessible. So there was certainly an increase in those. It remains to be seen whether it'll be the case with this one, and bearing in mind the caveat, of course, that getting drugs is getting illegal drugs is more difficult than it used to be in places where there's quite strict lockdowns and curfews in place, because you know it's just a lot more conspicuous, right, for drug dealers to be doing what they usually do. So some people are talking about the potential increase in online sales and deliveries by courier companies and things like that. So I think this is certainly something to monitor. But other than that, we don't have enough data to really for me to give you a very clear answer at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Are there any additional questions from the attendees or the panelists?
I have a follow-up a question that thank you again for your talk. So I'm just thinking, there's a scene in an old movie called New Jack City. And in that scene, the local Harlem drug dealer is basically seen giving out turkeys around Thanksgiving. And so if I gather, and I just want to have a sense of this, and some of what we talked about, is that these local drug dealers actually have a great deal more power on the streets. So in other words, going from 30,000 feet with COVID-19 down to the street level, is that the local drug dealer actually has a great deal more influence even in sort of official structures of governance. And as I gather, that's not only with regards to information, but the local drug dealer then isn't simply engaged in illicit drugs, but also all sorts of other activities. And there's a rush to either be seen as providing the PPE or in all of those places where there's a vacuum from governance, official governance, these illegal organized crime organizations step into that gap.
Absolutely. So, if you think back at Pablo Escobar, building soccer stadiums, throwing parties, giving away free food, that's the same sort of ideas. El Chapo building, providing safe water to his community. So yes, this is why I think, and I think it's with most things, it's never black and white. If those services were not provided by some of those criminal organizations in some countries, it just wouldn't be provided at all. So it does benefit to some people in the community. The problem, the challenge here, of course, for governments is that there's very little way to control and regulate it. And of course, this is not just pure charity. This is these sort of services are provided in expectations of a return in favor, right? So, for example, support for some corrupted political candidate in the future, or just asking population not to cooperate with the police when it comes to investigation and things like that. So, yeah, this is why I think this is certainly seen by a lot of organized crime groups and drug dealers more locally as an opportunity to build their own legitimacy. And I think that's, as we continue to try and respond to this crisis, and as we move on to trying to restart economies, we really need to start thinking about how this issue of organized crime involvement is going to be mitigated and addressed.
So in effect, at street level, you can't get PPE, but you can still get your local supply of illicit drugs.
Well, it really depends on the jurisdiction, and actually, yeah, it depends. And then, like, as I was saying, like, some groups are actually trying to find ways to get PPEs and ventilators and things like that. So yeah, everything is sort of scrambling to trying to adjust to not only shortages in illicit drugs, but also shortages in PPE and other important equipment. So there's a lot of movement going on, and a lot of things that are up in the air, and we certainly need to continue and monitor all that, and really try and collect better data on all this.